At 3 o'clock in the morning, while most of Venezuela was asleep, the sky above Caracas filled with aircraft. Not commercial flights, not cargo planes, United States military aircraft. Over 150 of them, moving in coordinated silence through the dark, carrying some of the most elite soldiers on Earth toward a target that had been planned, rehearsed, and prepared for months. The target was the presidential compound of Nicolas Maduro, the man who had ruled Venezuela for over a decade. The man who had stolen elections, imprisoned opponents, starved his own people, driven 8 million of his citizens out of the country, and survived every sanction, every diplomatic pressure campaign, and every previous attempt to remove him from power. Within hours, it was over. Nicolas Maduro was blindfolded. He was on a United States warship in the Caribbean, and Donald Trump was watching it all live from Mar-a-Lago, on screens set up in a draped-off room, calling it, in his own words, just like watching television. Then Trump posted the photo on social media. Then he called into Fox News. And then he announced something that no American president has said about another sovereign nation in decades. America would run Venezuela, and America would take its oil. This is Geo Polity. And this is the story of the most audacious act of American military power since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. What happened, why it happened, whether it was justice or empire, and why the answer to that question will shape the next 20 years of global politics. Welcome back to Geo Polity. If you have been following this channel, you have watched us build the most comprehensive picture of 2020 SIXS cascading global crises that exists on YouTube. Episode 1, the oil shock triggered by Trump's war against Iran and what it meant for your petrol prices and energy bills. Episode 2, China watching America's distraction and calculating whether to move on Taiwan. Episode 3, Trump defying his own Supreme Court over tariffs, while every household paid the price. Episode 4, Israel's invasion of Lebanon and 1 million people fleeing their homes. Episode 5, Trump's broken promise to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours and Putin still advancing while nobody stops him. This is episode 6. And it may be the most dramatic chapter yet, because what happened in Venezuela last month was not just a geopolitical event. It was a statement about what America under Donald Trump is willing to do. Where? And to whom? If you're new here, subscribe now and watch the full series, because each episode makes the next one make more sense. Let us start with the man at the center of this story, because to understand why Trump did what he did and why the world reacted the way it did, you need to understand who Nicolas Maduro actually was and what he had done to his country. Nicolas Maduro was not always a dictator. He was a bus driver who rose through the Venezuelan trade union movement, became a close ally of Hugo Chavez, and inherited the presidency when Chavez died of cancer in 2013. Venezuela at that point was still a functioning, if deeply troubled, country. It had the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger even than Saudi Arabia. It had a growing middle class, functioning universities, and a population that, for all its inequalities, could largely feed itself. What followed under Maduro's rule was one of the most complete economic and social collapses in modern Latin American history. Not because of sanctions, not because of American interference, though both of those things played a role, but primarily because of catastrophic economic mismanagement, corruption on a scale that is almost impossible to describe, and the systematic looting of a country's resources by its own leadership and military. By 2026, Venezuela's economy had contracted by more than 70% from its peak. A country that had once exported oil to the world was struggling to refine enough fuel for its own people. Electricity blackouts lasted up to 20 hours a day in major cities. Hospitals had run out of basic medicines for years. Infant mortality rates had climbed back to levels not seen since the 1950s. And 8 million Venezuelans had left. 8 million people, out of a total population of 28 million. More than 1 in 4 Venezuelans had concluded that there was no future in their own country and walked, boated, or driven to Colombia, Peru, Chile, the United States, Spain, and anywhere else that would take them. It was one of the largest migration crises in Latin American history. In 2024, Venezuela held a presidential election. The result was not close. Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate, won by a margin that independent observers estimated at roughly 70% to 30%. It was an overwhelming, unambiguous democratic verdict. The Venezuelan people wanted Maduro gone. Maduro simply announced that he had won. His electoral authority, staffed entirely by his own loyalists, declared him the victor with no credible evidence. Gonzalez fled into exile in Spain. The democratic opposition was met with arrests, violence, and intimidation. The United States, the European Union, and dozens of other countries refused to recognize the result. And Maduro stayed in power. The United States had put a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head on drug trafficking charges. He had been indicted in American federal courts. He was, in American legal terms, a wanted criminal. And he had spent years laughing at American threats from the safety of his compound in Caracas, surrounded by loyalist military units, knowing that no American president had been willing to pay the political and diplomatic cost of removing him by force. Until Donald Trump. Let us now talk about the operation itself. Because the planning and execution of what happened is extraordinary, whatever you think of the decision to do it. American intelligence services, primarily the CIA, had been building assets inside Venezuela for months. Officers operating undercover had established relationships with disaffected elements inside the Venezuelan military, the presidential security detail, and the civilian staff of Maduro's compound. They knew the layout of the buildings. They knew the guard schedules. They knew where Maduro slept, where his escape routes were, and where the steel-reinforced safe room was located that he had installed precisely for scenarios like this one. On the night of the operation, a drone strike, precise and surgical, took out Venezuela's primary air defense radar installations and cut power to the compound and the surrounding area simultaneously. Within minutes of the grid going dark, U.S. military helicopters were descending on the compound. Delta Force soldiers, the United States Army's most elite direct action unit, were on the ground before Maduro's security detail had fully processed what was happening. Maduro attempted to reach his safe room. He did not make it. He was apprehended in a corridor, reportedly in a tracksuit, having been woken from sleep by the sound of the power cutting out and the rotors getting louder. He was restrained. He was blindfolded. He was moved to a waiting aircraft. And within hours, he was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, a United States Navy warship positioned in international waters in the Caribbean. The entire operation, from first contact to extraction, took less than 40 minutes. Back at Mar-a-Lago, Trump watched the live feed with a group of senior officials and personal guests. He later said it was exciting and called it a great victory for the Venezuelan people and for the United States. He posted a photograph, the blindfolded Maduro surrounded by American soldiers on the deck of a warship, on social media. It became one of the most viewed images of the year. Then came the announcement that changed the tone of international reaction entirely. Trump said the United States would run Venezuela, at least temporarily. American officials, he said, would oversee the country's transition. American companies would be given access to Venezuela's oil reserves, the largest in the world, which would be sold on global markets with the proceeds going toward, in Trump's framing, repaying Venezuela's debt to the world and funding its reconstruction. He said it plainly, without diplomatic hedging, without legal justification. America would run Venezuela and America would take the oil. Those two sentences detonated across the international community like a second explosion. Let us now examine the reaction. Because the range of responses to what happened in Venezuela tells you everything about the fractures in the current global order. Inside Venezuela, the reaction was genuinely divided. In many working-class neighborhoods, places that had suffered the most acutely under Maduro's misrule, places where families had watched their children go hungry and their savings evaporate, there were celebrations. People danced in the streets. They held up photographs of Edmundo Gonzalez, the man they had voted for and whose victory had been stolen. They wept with relief that the man who had done this to them was finally gone. But in other parts of the country, and particularly within the structures of the Venezuelan state and military, the reaction was very different. Diosdado Cabello, arguably the most powerful and certainly the most feared figure in the Venezuelan regime after Maduro himself, assumed effective control of the country's security apparatus. Cabello is not a moderate. He is a hardliner who has run much of the regime's most brutal repression and who has deep ties to the military and the intelligence services. He is not someone who will quietly hand power to a democratic transition government. Jorge Rodriguez, the Venezuelan vice president, flew to Moscow within hours of the operation. Russia granted him immediate diplomatic reception. Vladimir Putin, who you will remember from episode 5 of this series, condemned the operation in the strongest terms and recognized Rodriguez as the legitimate representative of Venezuelan sovereignty. China, as we covered in episode 2, was equally outraged. Beijing called the operation a blatant use of force against a sovereign state and demanded Maduro's immediate release. The Chinese reaction was not simply diplomatic formality. China has significant economic investments in Venezuela oil contracts, infrastructure loans, and strategic partnerships built over years that now faced sudden uncertainty. The United Nations Security Council held an emergency session. Russia and China, both permanent members with veto power, demanded a resolution condemning the operation. It did not pass because the United States vetoed it. But the debate itself was a remarkable public airing of the fracture between the American vision of international order and the vision held by a significant portion of the world. France called the operation legally unacceptable. Germany expressed deep concern. The European Union, which had long called for Maduro's removal through democratic means, found itself in the uncomfortable position of welcoming the outcome while condemning the method. Privately, European diplomats described themselves as caught between relief that Maduro was gone and alarm at the precedent being set. And the precedent is the thing that matters most in the long run. Because what the United States did in Venezuela was not legal under any framework of international law that currently exists. It was not authorized by the United Nations Security Council. It was not carried out at the invitation of a recognized Venezuelan government. It was not a response to an imminent military threat to the United States or its allies. It was a unilateral military operation in a foreign sovereign country to remove its head of state and then announce American control of that country's resources. There is a word for that. Multiple words, depending on your perspective. Some call it justice. Some call it liberation. Some call it regime change. And some call it imperialism. The last time the United States did something broadly comparable in scale and ambition was the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. The stated justification then was weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to exist. The actual result was the removal of Saddam Hussein, 20 years of instability, a power vacuum filled by sectarian violence and Iranian influence, and a conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars with no clear resolution. That history does not mean Venezuela will follow the same path. The situations are genuinely different in many respects. But it does mean that anyone who has been paying attention to the past 20 years has reason to ask the question that is already being asked in Caracas, in Washington, in London, in Beijing, and in every foreign ministry monitoring this situation. What is the plan? Because capturing Maduro was the easy part. Or rather, it was the part that American military capability is genuinely excellent at. Precision. Speed. Overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment. The United States military has no rival in the world at this kind of operation. What comes after is harder. Enormously harder. The Democratic opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, the man who actually won the election, is in exile in Spain. He has not been brought back to Venezuela to lead a transition. He has not been installed as president. Instead, American officials are reportedly negotiating with elements of the existing regime, the very people who stole Gonzalez's election, who ran the repression, who built the system that destroyed Venezuela, in an attempt to construct a transition arrangement that American companies can operate inside. That gap between the democratic mandate of Gonzales and the pragmatic negotiation with regime remnants is where Venezuelan politics now sits. And it is an extraordinarily dangerous gap, because it tells the Venezuelan military, the Venezuelan intelligence services, and the Venezuelan political elite that the Americans are not actually there to deliver democracy. They are there to deliver stability and oil access. And those are different things. Cabello still controls the security apparatus. His loyalists are armed and entrenched in every institution of Venezuelan state power. Republican lawmakers in Washington are already talking about Cuba and Nicaragua as the next targets. One congressman said publicly the first tyranny has not survived President Trump, and the next two, their days are also counted. Cuba and Nicaragua heard that statement. Their governments immediately went to full security alert. They reached out to Russia and China for assurances. The message being sent from Washington, whether intentionally or not, is that American military power is now available as a tool for regime change in the Western Hemisphere without legal constraint, without congressional authorization, and without a clear plan for what comes after. Now let us connect this to the 5 episodes that came before it. Because as with everything on this channel, this story does not exist in isolation. Venezuela has oil, the largest proven reserves in the world. At a moment when global oil prices are at $100 a barrel because of the Iran conflict you heard about in episode 1, American control of Venezuelan oil supplies is not just a geopolitical statement. It is an energy strategy. Trump's language about taking the oil was not accidental. It was an attempt to offer American voters a tangible economic benefit from a military operation, cheaper energy from Venezuelan reserves to offset the expensive energy caused by Middle Eastern instability. Whether that strategy works economically is another question. Venezuelan oil infrastructure has been devastated by years of mismanagement. Bringing it back to productive capacity would require billions of dollars of investment and years of work. The oil is there. Getting it out of the ground and onto markets is a much longer project than any political announcement can resolve. China's reaction, which we covered earlier, connects directly to episode 2 of this series. Beijing has watched the United States demonstrate in Venezuela that it is willing to conduct unilateral military operations to remove governments it dislikes and take control of their resources. China's leadership is drawing its own conclusions about what that doctrine means for American behavior in the Pacific. If Washington is willing to do this in Venezuela, what does restraint look like when it comes to Taiwan? The answer, in Beijing's assessment, may be less than we thought. Russia's reaction connects to episode 5. Putin's immediate diplomatic embrace of the fled Venezuelan vice president was not simply humanitarian solidarity. It was a calculated signal that Moscow will provide an alternative pole of support for governments facing American pressure. The same way Russia has used energy and military relationships to build influence across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, the Venezuela situation gives Putin another opportunity to present himself as the defender of sovereign nations against American unilateralism. And the constitutional dimension connects to episode 3. Trump did not seek congressional authorization for the Venezuela operation. He did not invoke the War Powers Act in any conventional way. He used executive authority and classified intelligence operations to conduct a military action in a foreign country and then announced economic arrangements with that country, all without legislative oversight. The same Supreme Court that ruled his tariffs illegal is now being asked to consider challenges to the legal basis of the Venezuela operation. The pattern of unilateral executive action beyond constitutional constraint is becoming the defining feature of this presidency. So what happens next in Venezuela? And what does it mean for the world? The most optimistic scenario is a managed democratic transition. Gonzales returns from exile. A transitional arrangement is negotiated that brings together the democratic opposition, reformed elements of the military and state, and international oversight. Venezuelan institutions are rebuilt over years. Oil production recovers slowly. The 8 million Venezuelans who fled begin, some of them, to think about coming home. This scenario is possible. It requires patience, sustained international engagement, and a willingness to prioritize Venezuelan democratic development over American corporate oil interests. Whether the Trump administration has that patience and those priorities is a question that the coming months will answer. The second scenario is a protracted internal conflict. Cubeo and regime hardliners resist the transition. Armed groups loyal to the old regime, and Venezuela has many of them, including groups with ties to organized crime and to Cuban and Russian intelligence, conduct a campaign of violence against any emerging new government. American forces find themselves not as liberators who arrived and left, but as an occupying presence drawn deeper into Venezuelan internal politics month by month. This is the Iraq scenario. And it is the scenario that every serious analyst of Venezuela is warning about. The third scenario is regional destabilization. The Venezuela operation has already sent shockwaves through Latin America. Colombia, which shares a long and porous border with Venezuela and has absorbed millions of Venezuelan refugees, has condemned the operation while privately welcoming Maduro's removal. Brazil's government has been sharply critical. The Organization of American States is divided. Latin American solidarity, always complicated, always fractured, is being tested in ways that will have consequences for American relationships across the hemisphere for years. What does all of this mean for you, wherever in the world you are watching from? It means the world that existed before 2026, a world where American military power operated within at least a framework of international law and multilateral legitimacy, is receding faster than most people have processed. It means the questions being asked in foreign ministries from Berlin to Beijing to Brasilia are the same question in different languages. If America will do this in Venezuela, where else? Under what circumstances? With what limits? And if there are no reliable limits, how do other countries, friendly, neutral, or hostile to Washington, adjust their own behavior in response? It means the next few months in Venezuela will be a test case that the entire world is watching. Not because Venezuela is the most important country on earth, but because what America does there next will tell us something essential about what American power means in the 21st century. Whether it is a force for democratic order or a force for American interest dressed in democratic language. And it means that the series we have been building on this channel, the oil shock, the Taiwan risk, the tariff crisis, the Lebanon invasion, the Ukraine abandonment, and now the Venezuela operation, are not 6 separate stories. They are one story. The story of a world in which the rules are changing faster than the institutions designed to manage those changes can keep up. A world where power is being exercised more nakedly, consequences more selectively applied, and ordinary people in Caracas, in Beirut, in Kiev, in Taipei, in Belfast and Birmingham and Baltimore, left to absorb the costs of decisions they had no voice in making. That is the story Geo Polity exists to tell. Clearly, completely, without pretending it is simpler than it is. If this series is adding something to your understanding of the world, please like this video. 6 episodes in, your support is what keeps this analysis reaching the people who need it most. Subscribe if you are not already here. Episode 7 is already forming. The world does not stop. And neither do we. Share this with someone who watched the news about Venezuela and felt confused about whether to celebrate or be alarmed. The answer, as this video shows, is that both reactions are legitimate. And understanding why that is the case is exactly what Geo Polity is here for. Leave a comment. Tell us, was capturing Maduro justice or imperialism? Should America be running Venezuela? And are you worried about what comes next in Cuba and Nicaragua? We read everything. Your perspective shapes what we cover next. This is Geo Polity. Stay informed. Stay analytical. And we will see you in the next one.